So in 1966, Sir Ahmadu Bello, his best friend Tafawa Balewa, and Samuel Akintola and some other leaders were murdered brutally. The assassination happened during the first ever coup to be carried out in the country. This incident would later result to the Biafra War in 1967. You see, this is one fascinating history and a reminder that military government is a no-nonsense government. It is a system of government that we should not even consider practicing in this country any longer. So here is the backstory. Nigeria gained their independence in 1960, and by 1963, the colonial leaders handed power over to our own people. Among them were Sir Ahmadu Bello, Tafawa Balewa, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Samuel Akintola, and some other individuals in different regions, the West, the East, and the North. And that was the start of the first civilian government. But you know, the way these people were ruling as civilian leaders, the military leaders were not so cool with it, as they believed that corruption was running underground, so the military wanted to take over, either by force or by mutual agreement. And the only way to take over is to carry out a coup. A coup means taking power by force or by mutual agreement. In some cases, it might lead to bloody coup. So the objective was to overthrow the corrupt civilian government that has been ruling after independence in 1960. It was the first ever military coup in Nigeria, and that took place on January 15, 1966. The coup was primarily led by a group of young army officers, including Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nziogu and Major Emmanuel Ifeaju. They were mainly Igbo ethnicity. Apparently, the military were on the Emilokan level. They wanted to take over the country, but first they have to eliminate the leaders. So prior to the coup, Sir Ahmadu Bello and his colleague had earlier been informed that some military officers were planning a bloody coup against them. But you know, they probably turned deaf ear and took it as an empty threat, because they believed that they were the leaders in charge and they had all that it takes to protect themselves. And moreover, no one has the ability to take power away from them, except from the British colonial leaders who gave it to them in 1960. They didn't know that the military forces were much more stronger than them. So on 15th of January 1966, the day of the coup, Sir Ahmadu Bello was in his residence in Kaduna when the soldiers led by Major Chukwuma Nziogu stormed into the compound unannounced. They tried to walk into the building, but they were encountered by the security forces in the house. Immediately, they demanded Sir Ahmadu Bello walk out by himself. Otherwise, they would attack the building. At this time, Sir Ahmadu Bello was in his room upstairs with his wife and assistant. Hearing gunshots and noises, he knew that it was the coup plotters coming for him. He was alerted, but he remained calm at the same time. His guard attempted to defend the house, but they were overpowered. The soldiers broke into the house, and after a brief confrontation, Ahmadu Bello was shot multiple times and unalived at the spot. One of his wives and servants was also murdered at the attack. On the same day, another set of coup plotters went to Tafawa Balewa's residence in Lagos. In the early hours, soldiers had arrived unannounced. The Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa was held captive without much resistance. Unlike some other targeted leaders, there was little or no immediate violence at Balewa's house. He was easily arrested and taken out of his building, along with the Financial Minister, Chief Okotie Ebo, who had earlier tried to escape through the back door of his house. Tafawa Balewa and Okotie Ebo were driven out of Lagos by the military officers. They were taken to a remote area where they were murdered, where no one was able to find their body. And 6 days after, Balewa's body was discovered near a bush around the Lagos-Abeokuta road. He had been executed, but there was no obvious gunshot wound, suggesting he may have died from strangulation. And next to be executed on that same day was Samuel Akintola. In the early hours of the coup, soldiers led by Captain Emmanuel Onwobosi stormed Akintola's residence in Ibadan. Akintola was alerted and ready to attack. Unlike some other leaders, he chose to fight the soldiers. It was said that Akintola armed himself with rifles and attempted to defend his home, resulting to gunfights between him and the soldiers. Akintola reportedly tried to escape through the back door during the chaos, but he was cornered by the soldiers. Despite his effort to fight back, he was overpowered. He was shot multiple times and died from gunshot wounds. His death was one of the most violent of the coup, reflecting the deep political tension of the time in the western region. So after these top 3 leaders had been murdered, other political leaders were also murdered, including Brigadier Samuel Ademulegun, the commander of the 1st Brigadier in Kaduna. Also, Colonel Raphael Oshodende, the deputy commander of the Nigerian Army. They were all murdered on that very same day, January 15, 1966. The news of the coup sent a shocking wave around the country as at the time. as the top political leaders were all assassinated on the same day by the military bad boys. But the way that coup was carried out made a lot of people believe that the coup was a tribal fight because the leaders that were murdered were particularly from the northern and western region of Nigeria. But while the coup was initially successful at killing the political leaders, the military boys who carried out the coup would later fail to take over the country because 6 months after the bloody coup, a counter-attacking coup was launched by the northern soldiers against the eastern region. It was called the July Coup, led by Murtala and Danjuma. The coup was driven by anger over the killing of the northern leaders in January 1966. So sit back and listen to the results from the counter-coup in July 1966, which would later result to the Biafra War in 1967. So after the coup that eliminated the civilian leaders on January 15, 1966, Nigeria was left with no ruling government for just 24 hours. And immediately the next day, on January 16th, General Aguiyi-Ironsi was installed as the new head of state, becoming the first ever military president in Nigerian history. And this was where the tribal war seems to have started again, as it seems like the Northerners were not so cool with the decision because they were still busy mourning the assassination of their leaders, and in the midst of all this, Aguiyi-Ironsi, a man from the Igbo tribe, had taken over power. So it appeared to the Northerners that the coup was not a coup for all, but a coup for one. Meanwhile, other people did not see it as a tribal coup. Instead, they believed that the coup was for the betterment of the country. But you know one thing about Northerners is that they are different breed. They only hear go, they don't hear come. That is to say, when they make up their mind, they are set for it. The Northern military leaders took the January coup so personal that they promised to take back power from Aguiyi-Ironsi's government, either by force or by force. No mutual agreement, no settlement. The decision to take back power would later result to the planning of the July coup, also called the counter-coup. The coup was carried out 6 months after the first ever coup in January 1966. It was no doubt a sort of revenge on the eastern region because the officers who carried out the coup were mainly from the north, which include Lieutenant Murtala, Major Theophilus Danjuma, Major Martins Adamu, Captain Joe Garba, and some other northern officers. Unlike the January coup which targeted the political leaders, the July counter-coup focused on military officers who were linked to General Aguiyi-Ironsi's government and also Igbo origin. The coup was scheduled to be carried out on 29th of July 1966, but prior to that time, General Aguiyi-Ironsi had earlier been warned by his associates that the northern military boys were planning a coup to eliminate him, but he ignored the advice and did not take a decisive action to prevent it. Instead, he believed he could maintain control through the effort to reconcile the military factions. He also continued with the plan to centralize power through the Unification Decree, Decree number 34, which further aggravated northern fears of Igbo domination. So on the 28th July 1966, a day to the coup, General Aguiyi-Ironsi had traveled on an official visit to Ibadan, the capital western region, even though he was aware that a coup was likely going to take place. He proceeded with the trip, possibly believing that his presence would maintain order or show confidence. On getting to Ibadan, he stayed at the government house with the military governor of the western region, Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi. So the next morning, July 29, 1966, the northern soldiers, led by Major Theophilus Danjuma, surrounded the government house in Ibadan. They had laid ambush on every corner of the government house, leaving no route or space for Aguiyi-Ironsi to escape. And after much dialogue, they captured both General Aguiyi-Ironsi and Colonel Fajuyi. The leaders of the northern soldiers, Theophilus Danjuma, reportedly interrogated Aguiyi-Ironsi about his involvement or knowledge about the January coup, but Ironsi did not provide the answer they were seeking. The both men were taken away to a remote area on the outskirts of Ibadan, where they were brutally tortured and later executed by the coup plotters. Their bodies were reportedly dumped in a bush near Ibadan, and that was how Aguiyi-Ironsi was eliminated. The assassination of Aguiyi-Ironsi marked the end of his short rule as Nigerian head of state. He barely ruled for 6 months. So after that coup, it appeared to a lot of people that the fight was a revenge fight. It was a tribal fight. And if it should continue in this manner, the northern regions will not allow the eastern to rule, and vice versa. But you know, one way or the other, someone has to rule the country. So after the back and forth, Yakubu Gowon was chosen and installed as the new head of state on 1st of August 1966, about 3 days after the assassination of Aguiyi-Ironsi. Though Yakubu was not supposed to be the next head of state according to military ranking, but some of the reason why he was chosen was because Yakubu Gowon was neutral. Firstly, he was not directly involved in the coup that happened in January and in July, making him a standout officer with a clean sheet. Secondly, Gowon was 31 years old as at the time. He was a young, vibrant officer who has the potential to resonate with the youth in the society. Thirdly, Yakubu Gowon is from the Angas ethnic group in Plateau State, a group of people who connected with Hausas and Yorubas. Gowon was partial Hausa and also a partial Yoruba man. He was even a Christian, therefore he was installed as head of state with the belief that he will calm the ethnic tension and stabilize the country. But Gowon's system of government would later escalate into widespread violence between the eastern, western and the northern region. It eventually led to the Nigerian Biafra War in 1967, a war that saw Yakubu and Ojukwu turn worst enemy at the time. So sit back and listen, there's more to learn from the Nigerian Biafra War that happened a year after Gowon became head of state. So after Yakubu Gowon became head of state, following the July Counter-Coup, expectations were high as to how well he was going to perform. He was expected to restore stability and unity, stop the ethnic violence, maintain the federation, and many other things. It was clearly a heavy responsibility on his shoulder. But few months after Yakubu took over power, Nigerian problem became more critical as more conflicts arose from the deep political, ethnic, and economic tensions. The same set of problems that has been brewing 6 years prior. It escalated to a point where the Igbos were widely attacked because that July Counter-Coup triggered a wave of anti-Igbo violence in the north, leading to massacre of thousands of Igbo civilians outside the eastern region. The violence would eventually spread from the northern region down to Lagos. Even though they said Lagos is a no-man's city, it didn't seem like the Igbos were welcomed after the coup, because at one point the Igbos felt threatened in the city. Fearful for their lives, many Igbos fled back to their hometown in the southeast. And upon seeing the way that the Igbos were being treated, the eastern region leader General Odumegwu Ojukwu started moving towards secession. It was a way of withdrawing the Igbos out of Nigeria, and that was the first time Ojukwu attempted breaking the Igbos out of the federation. Meanwhile, Gowon on his own part was under pressure to maintain the unity of Nigeria, because if Ojukwu should successfully break the Igbos out of Nigeria, then Yakubu Gowon has failed his duty as the head of state. But what duty? The duty to unite the country, because that was why he was chosen in the first place. So after the back and forth, Ojukwu was called upon by Gowon's government for a meeting of reconciliation and settlement. But Ojukwu would refuse to attend the meeting because he does not seem to trust or fancy Gowon and his associates. He insisted that the meeting should be on a neutral ground, a place where he would feel safe. So the Nigerian government decided to choose Aburi in Ghana as a place of meeting. Aburi is a town located in the eastern region of Ghana. So both parties met in Ghana where they hosted the meeting. The meeting was tagged the Aburi Accord. Ojukwu and his associates met with Yakubu and his government. Their discussion was solemnly based on the continual unity and progression of the country and a way to stop the ethnic violence at the time. Ojukwu lamented on how the Igbos had been badly treated outside the eastern region. Yakubu on his own part resonated with him, shared his condolence and sympathized as the head of state. In the end, what they agreed to was decentralization of power equally, control of the military, and in order to prevent the escalation of political crisis in Nigeria. So that was what they agreed on in Ghana. But when Gowon returned to Nigeria, his government refused to fully implement what they had previously discussed, particularly the decentralization of military and political power. Instead, Gowon went on to create 12 new states from the existing region. The reason for the creation of the states was to prevent the collapse of the country and to also weaken the power of the eastern region. Apparently, Gowon was smart, but seems Ojukwu was smarter. So when Ojukwu saw that Gowon was trying to play smart game on him, he finally declared the independence of Biafra on 30th of May 1967, meaning the Igbos had broken out of Nigeria. This declaration was motivated by the desire to protect the Igbos from further violence and the belief that the Igbo region would thrive independently due to their oil wealth. And that was where the war began from. The war that Gowon was avoiding had finally come to happen. The country is about to get shattered, the unity is about to be divided, chaos is about to happen, hunger will strike the land, all under Yakubu Gowon's government. The Igbos would return to their region, enjoy their oil wealth, while Yakubu will fail his duty as the head of state. Those were likely the things running through Yakubu Gowon's head. Immediately, Yakubu declared a state of emergency and a war against Biafrans, because it became clear to Yakubu that a peaceful resolution was no longer possible. So Gowon began mobilization for military action. Then on 6th of July 1967, a month after Ojukwu declared independence of Biafra, the Nigerian military force launched the first attack on Biafran armies. They invaded the Biafran territory in Gakim. Gakim is a small town located in Cross River. It was the site where the Biafran soldiers were camped in when the Nigerian military force attacked. That point marked the official start of the war, as Ojukwu began to mobilize his own military force in retaliation to Gowon's attack. The Nigerian military force went from Gakim into Biafran territory, attempting to capture strategical areas in the eastern region. After the Gakim invasion, one of the places they attacked was Nsukka. That was called the Battle of Nsukka. By July 14, 2, 1967, the Nigerian force had captured Nsukka, a university town in northern Biafra, and as part of the plan to advance further into the Biafran region. And despite the attack, the Biafran army were also well prepared for a defensive war and launched counter-attack. They were finally able to take over the Midwest region in August 1967. The Midwest region is the present Edo and Delta states. The Biafrans were able to take over these places with the intention to create a route to Lagos. Then from Lagos, they can spread the war to the other region. Seems the Biafrans were fully ready also. But when the Nigerian government realized that the Biafrans are taking over the Midwest region, they were shocked, so they launched a counter-attack in a bid to push the Biafran back to their region. But by the time the counter-attack was launched, the Biafran soldiers had already gotten to Ore, the present Ondo state. This time, they were moving closer to Lagos. It was already September 1967. So the Nigerian force met and fought the Biafrans again in Ore. It was called the Battle of Ore, a battle that saw the Biafrans lose their ground as they were pushed back to Niger River. And by mid-September, the Nigerian army had defeated the Biafrans. They had taken over the Benin City and the Midwestern region. To make matters worse, the Nigerian force continued to murder the Igbos living in the Midwest, resulting in a widespread massacre and atrocities committed on Igbo civilians. So the Biafrans had no choice but to retreat back to their region. It appeared that they had miscalculated their moves in the Midwestern region that they had previously dominated, and that was where the defeat of the Biafrans seems to have started from. The failure weakened the Biafran military position and morale, therefore allowing the Nigerian military to regain the ground during the war. The Nigerian government would go on to impose blockade on the Biafrans. The Igbos were denied access to importation of food, arms, and medicine, which resulted to severe starvation and famine in the east. The Nigerian government aimed to weaken the Biafran war effort by isolating the region and cutting off their supplies, leading to one of the most humanitarian crises of the 20th century. The Biafrans began to starve as they did not have access to any food or anything. The image of the starving Biafran children caught the international attention, but despite efforts by international relief agencies, the blockade remained a central tactic of the Nigerian government to force Biafrans into surrender. At that point, the Biafrans could no longer attack. All they could do was defend their territory with the little strength that they have. So at this point, the hunger continued. Severe starvation hit the Biafran children and adults died like chicken on the streets. As the war for Biafran independence continued for 3 more years, an estimate of about 30 million people reportedly died. Majority of this death was caused by lack of food, which was a direct result of the blockade imposed by the Nigerian government on Biafra. So by the late 1969, Biafran's situation had become desperate. The Nigerian Federal Forces under General Yakubu Gowon had gradually reclaimed most of the territory initially held by Biafrans. Major cities like Port Harcourt, Owerri had fallen under the federal government of Nigeria. So in December 1969, Nigerian force launched a final attack on the Biafrans. As they saw that they were weak already and they do not have strength to fight, they targeted the last remaining stronghold of the secessionist states. And by January 7, 1970, Nigerian force captured the key Biafran town of Uli, which had been one of the last strongholds and a crucial supply route for the Biafrans. At this point, the Biafrans could no longer fight back. It has been 3 years of bitter war, with most of Biafrans captured under Nigerian control and Biafran forces exhausted. So General Odumegwu Ojukwu left the town and fled to Ivory Coast to seek asylum on January 9, 1970. He left the responsibility of negotiating peace to his second-in-command, Major General Philip Effiong. Then 3 days after Ojukwu left the country, General Effiong announced Biafran surrender. He made a formal statement acknowledging the end of the war and requesting a ceasefire. Then on January 15, 1970, Effiong officially handed over the instrument of surrender to Nigerian forces, effectively ending the war. The war that started in 1967 finally came to an end in 1970, with millions of lives lost and millions still on the brink of dying of hunger and sickness. The war left a big scar on the eastern region. Then in a bid to relieve the situation and to reconcile, Yakubu Gowon declared a no victory, no vanquished, meaning no side won the battle. The speech was made in order to relieve the effect of the war and to repaint the image of Nigeria in international level. So the dream of Yakubu Gowon to unify the country finally came to life as he continued his ruling government. While Ojukwu went into exile in Ivory Coast, the Igbos who represented the Biafrans were finally brought back into Nigeria and everybody became one again, even though a lot of lives and properties were lost during these 30 years of the war. But Yakubu Gowon himself would later be overthrown in another coup 5 years later by some military officers under his government, and he would later go exile in UK the same way Ojukwu did, while Murtala would become the next head of state and would be assassinated about 6 months after. So sit back and listen. There's more to learn from the aftermath of the Biafra War, how Murtala became head of state, and how Yakubu Gowon went into exile. So after the Nigeria Biafra War that saw millions of lives and properties lost, Ojukwu went into exile in Ivory Coast with the fear of being imprisoned or executed for his role in leading the war. Ojukwu sought refuge in a foreign country where he would be safe, and Yakubu continued his ruling government. The Igbos who survived the war were welcomed back into the second life. The ones who fled out of the country before the war also returned back to Nigeria. In a bid to rebuild the country, Yakubu Gowon began a 3R policy, which was Reconstruction, Reconciliation and Rehabilitation. It was aimed at healing the wound of the war, and it was during the time when Nigeria experienced an oil boom in the early 1970s. So Gowon's government leveraged on the oil wealth to fund the reconstruction of the country. The roads, the bridges, the schools that were destroyed during the war, everything underwent reconstruction, but the lives that were lost could not be brought back. So as the reconstruction began to take place, money was flowing in for Nigerian government through the oil sector, which made it easy for the reconstruction to be carried out. At the same time, corruption was running underground. The money that was meant to rebuild the community were being embezzled by some officials who were awarded the contract to rebuild. It was corruption in the government contract, of course, because by the mid-1970s, corruption had become increasingly rampant in the government, particularly in the awarding of the contract for reconstruction projects. Many officials were implicated in corruption practice, and it got to a terrible point whereby a cement scandal happened in 1975. It was called the Cement Armada Scandal. This scandal was one of the largest financial and logistical crises in Nigeria. So it happened that during the reconstruction, cement were needed for rebuilding and development. A lot of cement, much more than what Nigeria could produce. So the Nigerian government, under Gowon, placed large order for cement from international suppliers because the oil money created the belief that Nigeria could afford large-scale imports. However, the cement would later lead to financial problems. Due to poor planning and coordination, too many cements were ordered than what the country port could handle. So when the cement were being delivered, the Nigerian ports, especially in Lagos, became congested as ships carrying the cement began to arrive in large numbers. It got to a point where hundreds of ships loaded with cement were left at the port with no one to claim them. So the ship had to wait for months before they could offload their cargoes, which led to Nigeria being charged monthly for ship delay at the port. So apparently, the cement were left in the container at the port, and the longer it waits, the more money Nigeria owes the company that supplied them. And who ordered for this cement? It was the people that were awarded the contract in Nigeria, especially the white people. They capitalized on the oil wealth that Nigeria was getting at the time, and they ordered a lot of cement, much more than what they needed, just in a way to embezzle the money. So Gowon's government continued to spend unnecessarily, mostly on cement that they do not need. To make matters worse, the cement order continued from 1974 till 1976. With containers stocked at the port, this resulted in financial losses for Nigeria. So it became clear that the mismanagement and corruption had taken over Yakubu Gowon's government. Gowon's administration was increasingly seen as corrupt and ineffective, particularly in managing the economy despite Nigeria's significant oil wealth. The people still suffer unemployment and infrastructure. Meanwhile, the oil wealth was squandered by the old-headed military. So the people began to demand that power should be returned to civilian government. Though Gowon himself had initially promised a return to civilian rule after the end of the Nigerian Civil War in 1970, but he would later intentionally delay the return to civilian rule, claiming that the country is not ready or prepared for handing over, and that a lot has to be corrected before he could hand over to civilian rules. But many military officers did not seem to enjoy Gowon's plan of holding on to power, as they felt that he had overstayed his welcome and was not making any move to transition the country to civilian rule. So they planned a coup against him in a bid to remove him from power. The coup was meant to be bloodless and was led by Murtala and supported by Olusegun Obasanjo, with a group of junior military officers who were dissatisfied with Gowon's leadership. So the coup was meant to be carried out whenever Gowon was out of the country. So on July 29, 1975, Yakubu Gowon was in Kampala, Uganda, attending an Organization of African Unity Summit when information got to him that he has been overthrown. It appeared to Yakubu that he had been removed as the head of state. Upon hearing the news, Yakubu himself was not frightened as he remained calm and accepted his fate. So he decided not to return to Nigeria, recognizing the risk and potential instability back home. So he left the meeting, and from there he went to seek asylum in Togo, before eventually settling down in the United Kingdom, where he lived in exile for several years. So after the bloodless coup, General Murtala became head of state. He was largely accepted by Nigerians who were already tired of Gowon's government. So Murtala took over power in 1975. His own system of government was different. At first, he made sure he sorted out the cement scandal that Gowon's government had left behind. Upon taking office, he targeted those who had enriched themselves through corruption practice during the previous regime. His administration was known for being decisive and strong stance against corruption. He also emphasized on discipline, accountability, and transparency in government affairs, which helped restore public confidence in leadership. But even as good as Murtala's administration was, some members of the military were also dissatisfied with his leadership style, because he had a reputation of being too decisive. You know, Murtala was from the north, and some officers under his government who were from other regions felt that they were being sidelined in the power dynamic of the country. Among these officers was Suka Buka Dimka, who was from Plateau State, often referred to as the Middle Belt region. Dimka was one of the critics of Murtala's administration. Dimka would later go on to plan the coup that eliminated Murtala. The coup was carried out on Monday of February 13, 1976. On that fateful day, General Murtala Mohammed left his residence in Lagos and was on his way to work at Dodam Barracks, which is the military headquarters and the office of the head of state. He was traveling in his unarmored black Mercedes-Benz with his driver and his assistants, Lieutenant Akintunde Akinsenyiwa. And on getting to a traffic junction in Ikoyi, Murtala's car was ambushed by soldiers led by Dimka. They blocked his car and opened fire on it. General Murtala, his driver, and his assistants were assassinated in the attack. Immediately after the coup, Dimka went to the national radio station to announce the coup and make an attempt to seize power by taking over the station. But some loyal officers like Olusegun Obasanjo and Theophilus Danjuma quickly moved to suppress the coup. Even though Murtala has already been murdered, they refused to hand over power to Dimka, which means Dimka's coup was an abortive coup. It was unsuccessful. So when Dimka saw that he was unable to take over, and in a bid to avoid execution, Dimka fled out of the state, but he was eventually captured weeks later while hiding in the eastern part of Nigeria. Alongside him and several other military officers and civilians involved in the plot were arrested. Dimka would later face trial and was executed alongside the officers that planned the coup together with him. Olusegun Obasanjo then became the new head of state after Murtala's assassination. Obasanjo would later go on to rule the country for 3 more years before he finally handed over power to civilian government of Shehu Shagari, marking the end of the military rule during that period. Obasanjo became the first Nigerian military leader to transfer power to the civilian administration. Shehu Shagari would later go on to rule the country for about 4 years before he was later overthrown by Muhammadu Buhari.